Today we are starting part one of a two-part series that looks to help build a deeper understanding of greenhouse gas emissions in the commercial real estate market. Some of you may have attended some webinars in the past that focused on tracking greenhouse gas emissions in Energy Star Portfolio Manager, but we felt it was important to take a step back and look at how organizations are beginning to start this journey. Where does the data come from? How are CV firms defining different types of emissions within their portfolio, and what are some of the best practices that go into tracking, so that when you do get to Portfolio Manager to look at this information, you have some context around the data, you have a game plan for how to make it actionable. Next slide, please. So part one today, we will be hearing from two speakers, Joe Envick from Retech Advisors, who is their head of carbon solutions. We'll be giving a detailed primer on GHG emissions, how GHG inventories are conducted, and some of the best practices on managing the data process. We'll then hear from Ben Myers with Boston Properties, who will share his experience tracking greenhouse gas emissions, setting targets, and some of his key lessons learned. And then finally, we'll open it up to some Q&A. Next slide. I'd first like to give a quick primer on where Energy Star sits in this realm. So the purpose of the Energy Star program is to bring resources to the industry to help reduce U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. We approach that through energy efficiency. But why are we focused on buildings and plants at all? So for those that don't know, commercial buildings and industrial plants make up about 45% of all the U.S. CO2 emissions, which really makes it a prime area to look at for groups interested in GHG reduction programs, strategies, and then on the real estate side, in addition to helping to fight global climate change, real estate companies can also improve their bottom line here. Next slide, please. So one of the primary resources that we have that can be used in this area is Energy Star Portfolio Manager. It's a free online software platform that is widely used in the real estate industry, primarily as a benchmarking platform. Allows you to add your utility bills, and you can track energy usage, water usage, and waste over time. And you can use that information to understand how properties are comparing to others in your portfolio or in comparison to similar buildings nationwide. One of the additional features, though, is that we have hundreds of metrics that you can calculate from the information you add in there. And one of those metrics is greenhouse gas emissions. It allows you to do a few things with that data. One is track the combined direct and indirect GHG emissions for your properties. Joe is going to go into some more detail on what that actually means. It also allows you to track the benefits of green power, whether you have an agreement to purchase energy from a renewable energy source offsite, or whether you have something like rooftop solar. You can use Portfolio Manager to track the impacts on emissions from those projects. And then finally, you can download that data. There is a reporting tab in Portfolio Manager, which allows you to pull those metrics as well as others to understand your performance over time. Today, we are not going to get into the weeds on how to track in Portfolio Manager. We do have trainings, as I mentioned, that have been done in the past that dive deep into using the user interface and some different elements of tracking within Portfolio Manager. So I would advise anyone interested to visit our training page, energystar.gov/buildings/training, for more information about that. Next slide. And then finally, I do want to give a little heads up, something we've been working on for a few months and that should be available by the end of the year, hopefully, is a new GHG calculator. This will be something standalone outside of Portfolio Manager, but it will allow an estimation of GHG emissions based on user inputs. When you use Portfolio Manager to track your GHG emissions, we have elected one methodology to use for those calculations. There are, of course, several different ways you can look at GHG emissions. A lot of those things Joe will talk about and Ben will talk about today. So we felt it was important to develop a tool to allow a little bit more flexibility. If you have differences in emissions factors, location-based factors are what Portfolio Manager uses, but you can also use market-based or any local factors if you're in a city with a local ordinance. And then there's different methods to enter in data, either from Portfolio Manager, putting it into the tool directly, or manually entering it from another source, as well as modifying the fuel mix. So look forward to that for the end of this year. Without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Joe, who will get us started. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Craig. Good to be with everybody today. I see a lot of familiar faces on the attendee list, so good to be with you, and nice to meet those of you I haven't met before. If we go to the next slide, I have a title slide here. So I want to start with kind of the basics of carbon accounting in real estate. Obviously, greenhouse gas emissions and climate change are some areas of some of the most rapidly evolving and interesting research and kind of innovation on the business side, and increased understanding of the economic impacts of climate risk and opportunity. So there's a lot here. When we say the basics, there's a bunch of different directions that could go. What I'd like to cover today, though, is sort of key need-to-know topics. If you're in the commercial real estate space and you're looking to do a carbon footprint that is not only accurate but also actionable, hopefully what you get out of this webinar today will be a sort of roadmap to getting there, and then you'll get to see what one of the market leaders in this space, Boston Properties, is doing on taking ownership of its emissions and reducing them in ways both kind of standard and innovative. I think it's a really interesting program to look at, so I'm excited to dive in with Ben as well. If we go to the next slide, I'm going to cover kind of the very basics of greenhouse gases just to make sure we're on the same page. Apologies if that's a bit of a review for some of you, but I want to make sure we have the foundation well established. I want to talk through why do a footprint in the first place. I think sometimes we go straight to how do we do this, and we don't reflect enough on why we're doing this, because I think that feeds directly into how you design a good, effective footprint in commercial real estate. We're going to talk about 3 pillars of a useful footprint, and then we'll talk about at the very end some tools and resources that can help you get started. So if we go to the next slide, just quick background on me. I always joke that I've been working on carbon since before it was cool, but I'm more than excited to be working on carbon now that it is cool. And so I've led or overseen 30 carbon reduction initiatives and footprints for a pretty wide range of companies. I've done a lot of commercial real estate recently, but also done this for Fortune 500 companies, federal agencies, and national governments. Back in my ICF consulting days, I was involved with the EPA and the creation of the national greenhouse gas inventory for the whole country on an annual basis, and supported the development of some of the specific methodologies that went into that inventory at the time. I've worked on developing protocol compliant inventories for lots of different commercial real estate clients, including MetLife, Principal, Blackstone, and Welltower as some of the examples there. And then I also, a couple of years ago, founded and lead RETEC's Carbon Solutions practice, which is specifically focused on helping clients establish net zero programs that are based on data and the actionable intelligence that carbon footprints can provide. So if you go to the next slide, I want to do some basics here very quickly before we get into the meat of the presentation. So if you go ahead and advance again. Overview of greenhouse gases. So just to remind everyone, when we're talking about greenhouse gases, we're really talking about a collection of lots of different gases that are emitted from our activities, not just energy-related activities, but also things like industrial processes and refrigerant leaks. But of course, in commercial buildings, and in plants, for that matter, the largest source of emissions is from building energy consumption. Emissions are typically reported in carbon dioxide equivalent, or CO2e, since each gas has a different abundance in the atmosphere, a different amount of time it stays in the atmosphere, and a different impact on the amount of climate change that actually occurs. It's much easier to just sort of standardize that into a single value, so that all gets standardized down into carbon dioxide equivalent. And you can see some of those values on the right there just to kind of illustrate how much diversity there is in the gases, and this doesn't even include all of the less common gases. And just to kind of anchor you in what types of numbers we're talking about here, in 2019, total emissions from the entire U.S. economy was about 6,600 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents. If we go to the next slide, I'm sure most of you are familiar with this, but just a refresher on what we mean by scopes, because carbon footprints or greenhouse gas inventories are organized around scopes. And the scopes reflect the amount of control that the organization doing the inventory has over those activities. So Scope 1 emissions are direct emissions from activities that are directly controlled by the organization doing the footprint, things like natural gas combustion in your boilers, fleet vehicles, or any other vehicles of transportation that are owned and operated. Scope 2 is a special category of emissions. Technically, they're indirect because these are electricity emissions. So when you consume electricity at your properties, you're not actually emitting the carbon at the property. That's coming from the power plant, but it's a pretty direct connection. When you buy that electricity, that means those emissions occur. So those get their special category. And typically, Scope 1 and 2 emissions are considered the most important, the most directly controlled emissions. And if you look at a lot of the frameworks that are out there, like science-based targets or others, they tend to prioritize Scope 1 and 2 in terms of mandatory reporting. And then scope 3 emissions are any other indirect activities, or emissions from any other indirect activities that are induced by your business activities but not directly from your business activities. So for example, employee commuting, right? You're inducing your employees to commute to work, but you're not, the emissions aren't actually coming from an asset that you control. It's from their personal vehicle. Same thing with business travel. And in some cases with tenant emissions as well, although there are lots of different interpretations of how tenant emissions should be handled in commercial real estate, which we're going to dive into a little bit later. So quick overview of scopes there, just to refresh everybody. If you go to the next slide, we often hear these terms science-based targets being thrown around a lot, and I just want to clarify that when we say science-based target, that is both a concept, it's a kind of lowercase s, lowercase t, but it's also a specific organization, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which is an initiative focused on kind of encouraging companies to set emissions reduction targets that are aligned with the Paris Agreement and with what is necessary to avoid the worst effects of climate change. So the way to think about a science-based target is, and kind of illustrated by this graph on the right, is there's a certain trajectory that the world as a whole needs to be on in order to avoid the worst effects of climate change. Generally, that's considered to be at least limiting global warming to 2 degrees Celsius, 1.5 degrees if possible. So what a science-based target does is says, okay, what's the global goal that's necessary to get to that objective? And then if we were to sort of prorate that down to the company level, what is the individual contribution that each company would be expected to make, or each organization would be expected to make in order to be a part of the solution? So that's where this notion comes from, and there's a whole kind of detailed target setting methodology that comes out of that. But I just wanted to define that quickly, since science-based targets are quickly becoming sort of the dominant definition for what a good climate-aligned emissions reduction target looks like. If we go to the next slide here, speaking of targets, I want to briefly highlight just how quickly the trend towards setting aggressive decarbonization targets is rising. So this is a great data set maintained by Natural Capital Partners, so I highly suggest you check out the full article if you want to learn more about this. But basically, back in 2015 or so, about 4% of the Fortune 500 companies had some sort of science-based target or renewable energy goal or carbon neutrality goal, and now it's nearing 30%, and that's up as of 2020. So I would suspect as this data gets updated, that could easily exceed 40 or 50% in the near future. So this is being quickly adopted in a way that few other business practices have been in human history. So it's starting to become, I think, quickly mainstream across all sectors, not the least of which is commercial real estate. Go to the next slide. Great, and I just want to highlight some of the frameworks that are out there that govern how one should report on and or set targets around emissions reductions. There's a lot of them. It's a bit of an alphabet soup, as we often joke, but a few of the big ones here: science-based targets, as we already discussed, Carbon Disclosure Project, or formerly known as Carbon Disclosure Project, now technically it just goes by CDP, is another widely used one with over 9,600 companies and 413 of which are real estate, reporting on their emissions and receiving a score on their emissions performance, as well as the policies and reduction programs that they've set around their emissions. Then you have RE100, which is more of a renewable energy goal, not specific to emissions, but of course closely related to that, and that's for kind of large global brands. You have TCFD, which I'm sure everyone on the call is familiar with, which is related to both climate risks, both physical and transitional risk. And then you have some new kids on the block. You've got the UN Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, which is not to be confused with the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative. Those are two different things. And then you have the ULI Greenprint Net Zero by 2050 commitment, which is a commercial real estate specific commitment. And in fact, there's just announced 24 hours ago or so a new initiative underway at ULI to focus on kind of decarbonizing the built environment as well. So this is the kind of thing where if you pick up the newspaper, or figuratively, I'm not sure who picks up newspapers anymore. Some people do, but if you pick up the Google on about a weekly basis, you will very likely see a new framework or a new guidance document or a new something regarding emissions that's coming out. This is a rapidly evolving fluid space that can be tricky to keep your head around. If we go to the next slide. I want to clarify some terminological things here. So these are words that get thrown around rather willy-nilly, I have to say, in this space sometimes, and I just wanted to kind of organize how we talk about them. So in the how do we describe what we're emitting category come the terms carbon footprint, greenhouse gas inventory, and carbon accounting. those terms are basically interchangeable. I will use them interchangeably, and those people as well. So doing a greenhouse gas inventory is the same thing as doing a carbon footprint. In the how to reduce category, you see lots of different terms for this. So carbon neutrality and net zero are two kind of specific objectives, two states that you can get to if you have reduced your emissions by a sufficient amount. I won't haggle over the definition of those terms because there is still some lack of clarity there. In fact, there's such a lack of clarity. The science-based targets is actually taking a crack at defining net zero once and for all, which I'm looking forward to that guidance as it comes out. You might hear the term decarbonization thrown around. So this is just the policies and programs and objectives around reducing the carbon emissions, or really greenhouse gas emissions as a whole, from a portfolio or from a company. And then you have science-based targets, which we already talked about. So just good to clarify the kind of two buckets that this terminology sometimes falls into. If we go to the next slide, I want to address quickly why do a footprint. So I had an old friend and mentor who used to joke that doing a carbon footprint is like counting deck chairs on the Titanic, right? It's a fool's errand on a sinking ship. And I actually think that's the wrong way to think about that. I think doing a carbon footprint is like counting icebergs on the Titanic, right? It's about identifying strategic risks and opportunities ahead of where you're going and adjusting your business practices and your investment strategy accordingly. So a few of the specific reasons to do a footprint in the first place is obviously to understand where your emissions are coming from. Sometimes you might find that surprising. To track those changes over time, which is most effective when it's done on an absolute basis. So your total emissions on an intensity basis, which could be per square foot, which is most common in commercial real estate, or it could be per unit of output in the manufacturing sector, for example. And on a same store basis, which is really the most useful way to see how your interventions are or are not changing the emissions at the property level. Footprints are also increasingly important to manage your exposure to transition and reporting risk. We're seeing a lot of new guidance coming out and a lot of new rules coming out with the SFDR regulation in Europe, for example, around reporting on emissions. So this is something that investment portfolios and real estate portfolios are increasingly going to need to get their heads around if they want to stay ahead of the global transition to low carbon and all of the regulatory implications that come along with that. And I think the most important, arguably, and my sort of favorite to talk about, is carbon footprints aren't just an accounting of what you're already doing. They're also a way to look to find and prioritize where your greatest cost reduction opportunities are, right? Where you can create value in your portfolio by decarbonizing it or making strategic investments in high payback carbon reduction projects. So I prefer to think of carbon footprints as a sort of means to an end to get to an actionable strategy rather than a sort of annoying accounting requirement that just sort of has to happen, even though it may also be that in some cases. But generally, like I said, a footprint is necessary to build an effective, targeted, and data-driven decarbonization program. You kind of have to start with the footprint. Go to the next slide. I want to talk here as my kind of final section about 3 pillars of a useful footprint. So spoiler alert, if you're thinking that, boy, this sounds complicated from a mathematical perspective, the math really isn't the hard part here. You do have to do some spreadsheets or plug some numbers into Portfolio Manager or into a software package somewhere. But where the most of the brain power and decision making needs to happen is not around the math. That's pretty standardized. It's around these key things, which are boundaries, so sort of whose emissions are whose. It's data quality, how do you improve the actual usefulness of the outputs, and then it's around taking your carbon footprint and turning it into a meaningful action plan. So I want to walk through some ideas behind each of those pillars here just for a moment. So go to the next slide. The first is boundary. So this asks the question, which emissions exactly are ours? So that's the organizational boundary to start with. So how do we sort of draw a box around our operations and say which emissions are we going to take responsibility for and try to reduce? The most common things in commercial real estate, or the most common methods for doing this, are operational control or financial control. So do we have control over a specific activity? And if so, it goes in our scope 1 and 2 emissions. And if not, it goes in our scope 3 emissions. Equity share is another way to do this, where you break it up across assets based on your equity ownership of those assets, but that's far less common in commercial real estate. And as I said, even if you're not including certain activities in your control boundary, you can still report those optionally as part of your scope 3. And then the second consideration when you're setting a boundary is which emission sources are included. So what this should be is anything that's material to your business, anything that materially impacts your operations or your environmental footprint. Typically in commercial real estate, building energy consumption, as you would expect, is going to be the core of your footprint. But some of the key decisions you're going to have to make in commercial real estate are whether to include things like refrigerants, owned and operated vehicles, business travel, and commuting. Depending on the portfolio and its particular operations, those may or may not be material. So one of the key things you want to do up front is deciding, should these be in or should they be out? And that comes down to how big they are in terms of total emissions, as well as how much control you have over them, and what the data availability is like. I'm happy to dive into some of the considerations on those in the Q&A if that would be helpful. And then a key question that I pulled out on its own here, which is really a boundary question, but it's probably the most pressing boundary question for commercial real estate, is how to handle tenant activities. So this kind of landlord versus tenant boundary is really key. Different folks kind of take different approaches here. There are some commercial real estate organizations that historically have not included tenant emissions at all. Not to be overly prescriptive here, but I do not recommend that as a market-leading strategy. I think when your business is providing a place for tenants to occupy, if you're not including tenant emissions, you're going to be increasingly criticized for not fully representing the true emissions impact of your activities. But there is still a question about how to account for those tenant emissions, right? So some folks say all tenant emissions go into scope 3 because we don't have direct control over them. Some folks say that in certain property types or lease types, we might consider tenant emissions to be scope 1 and 2. So if you have a gross lease where the landlord is paying the utility bills, you can use utility bill payment as a proxy for control. And in that case, those tenant activities would fall into scope 1 and 2. So there's some hard thinking that has to happen here on how you build a set of boundaries that are kind of intellectually honest and actionable, but that are also possible based on the data availability that you have. And as I said, some organizations, for example, Science-Based Targets says that even if you count your tenant emissions as scope 3, if they represent 40% or more of your total emissions, you still need to include them in the science-based target. So I think you're going to start to see more and more frameworks essentially mandating that you consider tenant emissions if you're not already. If we go to the next slide here, I want to talk a bit about data quality, and not to overwhelm you with a flow chart here, but this is kind of a representative example of what a typical data flow for a carbon footprint looks like. So everything in blue is an original data source. So you typically, in commercial real estate, you're starting with property information or a property list. You're starting with utility data for energy, waste, maybe refrigerants that comes from one or a variety of sources. And then you have some sort of lease and billing data about what the lease type is and how tenants are being billed for their energy in that space. That then kind of flows into an estimation of what the known whole building data is, so the actual data that you actually have. You're never going to have 100% data completeness in commercial real estate. I've worked with maybe 2 clients over the years that actually had fully complete whole building data. There's always going to be some gaps, there's some uncertainty, there's some outliers. And so the key is reducing those over time. So as the first observation there says, the name of the game here is continuous improvement. But in order to kind of represent a complete carbon footprint, we often recommend, and I think this is a pretty common practice, to kind of fill in the gaps with averages from the rest of your portfolio or with using market data if possible. Now you need to be thoughtful and transparent about that, right? You don't want to pass off estimated data as actual data, but you're also, if you don't have data for half of your property, simply not reporting on those emissions would be materially underrepresenting your total emissions profile. So for most folks who are doing a footprint for the first couple of years, there's got to be a substantial estimation component, but you need to use it cautiously with a plan to improve over time. So once you've got your total estimated building data, then you calculate your emissions. And this is the simple act of applying emissions factors. This is the part that everybody thinks is where all the action is on a carbon footprint, but in reality, it's just taking one number times another number. I'm sure folks who work closely on emissions factors are probably angry at me for saying that, because there is a lot of work that goes into finding the right factors and making sure those factors are accurate. But most of that work's already been done for you. So that's sort of a solved problem. There's in fact an EPA emissions factor database you can go to, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later, that solves most of those problems for you. The key is just making sure you have the right factors and all the latest information. And then once those emissions are calculated in commercial real estate, there needs to be some thought given to how those are going to be apportioned out between landlords and tenants. This is the point where you then pull in your commuting or travel data or other kind of corporate level data that's only applicable to the landlord. Obviously doesn't really affect the tenants. And then through the combination of all of that, having parsed it out into into landlord and tenant emissions, then you have a complete carbon footprint. And the key point here, and I think one that Ben's going to double down on in a little bit, is that whatever you put into this process is what you get out. The quality of the data that goes in is the quality of the insight that comes out. No amount of math or fancy Excel formulas is going to solve an underlying data problem, and you shouldn't pretend that it does. So if your data quality is quite poor, or your data completeness is poor, priority number one for getting a good actionable footprint should be improving that data quality. If we go to the final slide here, I'm just going to close this out with my third pillar, and it's taking action. So how do you actually take the results of a carbon footprint and turn it into an actionable decarbonization plan? Well, a couple of thoughts: priorities and prioritization. So, or pathways and prioritization, I should say. So on the pathway side, this is kind of an example of what a decarbonization pathway can look like. It's a sort of wedges analysis that says, okay, we want to get to 100% emissions reduction. How much of that is going to come from efficiency, renewables, RECs, et cetera? And every organization's pathway is going to look a little bit different. But in order to know what the relative contributions are from each of these potential interventions, you really need to know what the starting emissions are. Right, so if you say we're going to save 50% on LEDs, but only 40% of your emissions come from electricity, well, you're probably not going to save 50% on LED retrofits, right? So there needs to be some kind of level setting, and a carbon footprint helps you do that. It helps you track that over time. And then the other way to think about carbon footprints is as a prioritization tool. So this footprint that's done well and it's done at the property level lets you target emissions reduction projects much more effectively than you could otherwise. So you can target different portfolio segments by comparing sort of what all your usual financial metrics of doing like an HVAC retrofit or an LED project or a solar panel, but you can also compare that with what the carbon reduction impact of that retrofit would be. This is a little kind of a reduced, scaled down version of a really good EPA graph from the EPA Power Profiler that shows that not every kilowatt hour is equal. This is the carbon emissions per megawatt hour for a megawatt hour in each of these markets. So the California, the CAMX market is about 500 pounds per megawatt hour. A couple of the other markets in the Midwest in particular, some of the MROE over there, is as much as 4 times higher. So another way to think about that is for every kilowatt hour that you burn, you emit 4 times more carbon in Ohio than you do in California, right? So when you're thinking about prioritizing emissions reductions across your portfolio, there is actually a meaningful locational difference, and that's not even accounting for these more advanced strategies, which are the fact that each utility actually has its own emissions factor. These are pretty hard to track, and they're not typically tracked centrally. But you can, in some cases, get utility-specific emissions factors, and that's a great way to get more granularity. And then a kind of a rising trend right now among some of the more sophisticated carbon footprinting efforts is looking at time of use accounting. So when you consume that kilowatt hour during the day actually has different carbon impacts. If you're consuming it at a time when solar power is up and running on the grid, it might have a very low marginal carbon impact. But if you're consuming it when a natural gas peaking plant is running, you might be having a high carbon impact. So there's lots more granularity you can get to here, although for the average commercial real estate portfolio, those two considerations are not quite as pressing, right? Because oftentimes you just don't have that data available. So if we go to my final slide here, I'll wrap it up very quickly. A couple of resources for you to be aware of. I just want to note that there are certain aspects of carbon accounting that are a solved problem, like where to get your emissions factors, guidance on how to set your boundaries, but you still need to put in some effort, some expertise, and some adaptability, right? It's not like you can just kind of plop this in a spreadsheet and be done. You really need to put some brain power behind it and making strategic decisions around how you want to structure your footprint and what you want to get out of it. A couple of key resources to be aware of are the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Corporate Standard. This is the holy book, I may say so, of carbon accounting. It basically it's a long document that has just about everything you want to know about getting started, but there's still some room for interpretation even with all that guidance. And then, as I mentioned, emissions factors are largely a solved problem for most sources in most markets. Lots of different good sources for these. The Climate Registry is one, and then the EPA Emissions Factor Hub is also a very good way to get those factors too. So I'm gonna wrap it up there and hand it over to Ben.
Joe, that was a fantastic overview. Thanks for setting the table and helping me as I move forward with some lessons learned at Boston Properties, where I currently serve as the head of sustainability. I have about 15 years of experience tracking greenhouse gas emissions, but only about years ago, when I became head of sustainability at BXP, did I have to really seriously think about some of the process and problems Joe presented for a portfolio of 52 million square feet in Boston, New York, San Francisco, DC, and LA that we own and actively manage. So Joe, I'll try to build off of some of what you said, and happy to take some Q&A after I go through a few of the lessons learned at BXP. First, I'll say, in response to your presentation, absolutely include tenant emissions, and certainly try to collect data, don't estimate whenever and wherever you can. And I do understand the challenges there, but that's more guidance than lessons learned. So let's move forward with the lessons learned. Next slide, please. So our climate framework includes climate action, resilience, and social good. On the climate action side, it's all about greenhouse gas emissions curtailment, energy and water efficiency, green building strategy, and how we manage our assets to improve efficiency, developing renewable energy on-site and off-site. We've got now 12 renewable energy installations on-site and several off-site commitments for additional renewable energy, and moving towards carbon neutrality by 2025. So greenhouse gas mitigation, greenhouse gas reduction has become central to our business and everything we do, from how we develop new buildings and how we manage our existing portfolio, how we procure energy, how we invest capital in our buildings, and carbon neutral by 2025 has only become a target because we've been doing greenhouse gas emissions management and monitoring and inventory and all the other terms that Joe had for measuring greenhouse gases since 2008. Next slide. Some quick highlights. We've developed a bunch of green buildings, 23 of them, and our portfolio is now 55% LEED certified at the highest gold and platinum levels. We've cut our operational emissions intensity over 70%, so that's greenhouse gas emissions per square foot, commonly shown in kilograms carbon dioxide equivalent per square foot per year. And we've reduced our energy use 27%, measured typically in kBTU per square foot per year. And we've done that by a combination of investing in efficiency and also shifting to renewable sources. We have a science-based target. This is a science-based target from the Science-Based Target Initiative, and it's at the 1.5 degree C level, first office company in North America to have a science-based target approved at the most ambitious 1.5 degree level. And as I mentioned, we are trucking towards carbon neutrality by 2025. A couple other awards and accolades, but most importantly, we received the 2021 Energy Star Partner of the Year Sustained Excellence Award, and all of our properties that are actively managed are benchmarked using EPA Portfolio Manager, which has helped us not only manage and monitor energy consumption and reward performance, but also do some early greenhouse gas emissions inventories. Next slide, please. Our goals were a major step for our program. We started setting targets in 2015. We set an energy use reduction target of 32% below a 2008 base year by 2025. So as I mentioned, we have this 27% reduction pre-COVID, not counting reduced occupancy in the 2020 data set. We've also set a science-based target, which I had mentioned, and we've cut our square foot intensity from 5.6 kilograms down to 2.7 pre-COVID and 1.3 through the 2020 calendar year. So that's 1.3 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per square foot. We also have a Scope 3 emissions reduction, and we are on our way towards reducing our Scope 3 emissions, mostly embodied carbon from new development, 14% by 2025, and we've begun assessing embodied carbon on all of our new development projects, where in a typical year we may do $1 billion of new development. That is a rather sizable carbon footprint that we need to address as a company alongside our operational carbon emissions. And then finally, our carbon neutral by 2025 operations goal, continuing to reduce our Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions across our portfolio to zero, from 9.2 kilograms per square foot per year in 2008 down to 1.3 in 2020. So we're 71% of the way towards carbon neutrality. Next slide, please. Then we have 3 other goals I should mention: our water goal, waste goal, green building certification goal. These goals often complement and support greenhouse gas emissions, but don't require greenhouse gas emissions curtailment. Next slide, please. So this shows the decoupling of energy and carbon performance over time. So the dark blue line is our site energy use intensity across our portfolio dating back to 2008. And the light blue line shows our carbon emissions intensity of our portfolio, also dating back to 2008. And the decoupling of energy intensity from carbon intensity is largely due to cleaner sources of energy and alternative renewable energy. So this is a market-based emissions inventory accounting process. Next slide. Some lessons learned. I'm just going to jump through 5 lessons very quickly. Let's start. Next slide, please. First, you always start with the why, and I know Joe addressed this also at the top of his deck. Simon Sinek said people don't care about what you do, they care about why you do it. And I try to keep that in mind anytime I'm proposing or persuading people that I work with to do something differently. We really branded our entire sustainability program Be Responsible. It was about taking responsibility for the negative externalities associated with the real estate enterprise. We recognize climate risk and the global climate crisis as an existential threat, not only for humanity, but also real estate assets in the cities where we operate. They're largely coastal: Boston, New York, San Francisco, DC, and LA. So we've been focused on this why, how we can be climate leaders, really taking a leadership role and recognizing the risk of inaction. If we don't do anything on climate as a global society, well, we will really see huge economic, geopolitical risks in the near term. We also want to disrupt the status quo. We want to show what leadership looks like. And so doing that requires understanding greenhouse gas emissions, because the greenhouse gas emissions and the rate of reduction is going to very much dictate an uncertain climate future. We've also seen rising customer interest almost across the board, and that is certainly part of the why. We want to develop more sticky relationships with our customers. We want to lead in sustainable real estate, and as they have adopted more aggressive sustainability targets, we want to offer real estate that helps them achieve their sustainability goals. There's also a growing demand from investors. More institutional investors are allocating capital to ESG funds. In fact, those funds grew over 40% from 2018 to 2020, up to $17 trillion of assets under management in ESG funds just in the U.S. Really an astounding number, explosive growth of ESG investing. And it makes us a more purposeful company. People want to work at a company that's doing well by doing good. So there's a lot of whys. There's enough whys to go around. I think we need to focus on the why when building the case for a greenhouse gas inventory in real estate. Next slide. Abstraction is absolutely a barrier. When we started, a lot of executives, senior people who've been working in real estate were focused in some regard on sustainability, but they understood it as energy, water, and waste. It takes time to convince people that focusing on emissions is important. So energy, water, and waste have been common metrics for efficient real estate operations, but carbon is not as familiar to people who have been working in the real estate business. So making emissions concrete, really tangible and relevant to the business performance is hard, and we should approach it that way. We're not expecting it to just land on people as like, oh yeah, now we have to focus on metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So it's spending a lot of time to define the metrics, to benchmark properties and show connections between energy and carbon, and start to identify and make real these greenhouse gas intensities as a performance parameter in all of our business meetings is a good thing to start to do. So we're trying to get these into the discussion. I'm actually in Washington, D.C. today to meet with our team here to go through our portfolio, and we talk a lot about greenhouse gas intensities and how we reduce our intensities at our sites through both efficiency and also procurement. On-site emissions are easier to understand. The fuel you combust on-site is often easily understood as producing greenhouse gas emissions, whether it's from a diesel generator or a hot water heater that's gas-fired. So starting with Scope 1 and really developing a case around decarbonizing Scope 1, electrification, it often resonates more with people than Scope 2 emissions or even Scope 3 emissions, which are often further away from the operational control of the enterprise. Something like HFCs might not be the right place to start. Refrigerants and refrigerant leakage, very, very abstract. Start with what's tangible, like diesel, on-site gas combustion is some advice. Also allocate a lot more time for stakeholder engagement and education. People are going to take baby steps often, and so really take the time to walk them through the whys and also walk them through examples, like benchmark examples and intensities for certain properties, and contrast high-performance buildings versus low-performance buildings, and tease out, how carbon correlates with the high and low performance. Regs have also helped. I should mention that. I have this theory that about 5% of the market moves on altruism, another 15 moves on really wowing their customers and developing customer relationships and customer preference for sustainability. And then you have about 30% that moves on ROI, simple ROI for energy performance and energy payback periods. And then the other 50% is mandates, really getting regulations in place that bring up the bottom. And what regulations like Local Law 97 and the Building Carbon Performance Standard in Boston have done is they've set a price of carbon. That makes it less abstract. That makes carbon less abstract because now you have a price of carbon that's being imposed on the business exogenously, which makes our case for paying attention to carbon stronger. Next slide. Keep scoreboards. When there's a scoreboard, people play differently. We keep a lot of scoreboards with Energy Star, looking at EUIs, carbon intensities, the goals that I went through. Celebrate and reward success. When you have scoreboards and people are doing well, recognize them. We are what we celebrate, so continue to celebrate good performance. And when celebration doesn't work, when making these goals doesn't work, absolutely shame underperformance. Throw the shade, if you will, as the kids say it today, and definitely point out where we can do better. Next slide, please. Garbage in, garbage out. Joe mentioned that I'd lean in on this, but GHG assessment starts with primary data collection. It starts with developing a data management system that's robust, from utility bills, sub-meter consumption, real-time energy monitoring, manual entry. You need to spend time and invest in the infrastructure and the training to make it high-quality data input before you get to the mathematics of carbon inventories and applying carbon emissions factors to different fuels. That's really the easy part. You've got to focus on what you're putting into the hopper. You need to establish checks and controls to eliminate human error. There's unit conversion error, there's key punching error. One thing we've done is we've automated our utility bills, so about 80% of our data flows directly from utility bills into Portfolio Manager. We developed a link between our bill pay system and Portfolio Manager, which has worked beautifully. We also use Portfolio Manager and routinely check entries in Portfolio Manager, working with a company Measurable to run algorithm checks and run data checks and point out any sort of anomalies in the data set month over month or year over year, whatever we have to compare. We also go through a rigorous data assurance process with a third party that provides assurance of our disclosures that we disclose annually, and that checking process is very valuable, particularly as data becomes integrated into financial reporting. And finally, just checking and developing internal expertise and having resources allocated to this. A lot of people are trying to do this work as a side project or in addition to their other job. That's a recipe for failure. Really, you need to allocate the time, resources, and by time and resources, it might be hiring a consultant like Joe to help you out. This is not something that people should be tackling as an afterthought. Next slide. So GHG emissions management is a program, not a process, right? It's not something that you're just going to get through without having management buy-in and this tone from the top. Our CEO, Owen Thomas, was very much behind the ULI initiative that Joe mentioned that was announced this week, and Owen has been an absolutely fantastic advocate for decarbonizing across our company. Focus on sustainability and ESG governance, right? So this is part of a larger sustainability and ESG play, and as ESG becomes more important to your stakeholders, greenhouse gas and accurate greenhouse gas emissions accounting is going to be extremely important for your enterprise. Have a data management system and information technologies and automation. This has involved a lot of partnership with our IT group, installing infrastructure, working with a company, Hatch Data, to do a lot more data management and integration of real-time data into our decision-making. Setting internal stakeholder goals, training and education. Externally aligning with stakeholders, including customers, our tenants, with green leases, so you can do the data collection you need to do, and they have to provide data where you're having trouble sourcing data, making sure you have the green lease clauses baked into your lease contracts to get that data from your customers. Think about it as risk management, right? There's transition risks associated with climate change and carbon emissions that are coming down the line, like Local Law 97. Finally, look at the upside, the opportunity, product design, development, marketing. There's going to be more customer preference for net zero product, and you're not going to be able to advance on net zero without a enterprise understanding of greenhouse gases and having a program that really extends from the boardroom to the boiler room. Next slide. That's it for me. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Ben and Joe. I appreciate that. We have a number of questions that have come through, quite a large number of people on today's webinar, so we'll try to get through as many as we can in the next 10 minutes. All right, so I guess I'll kick things off here and pose this. So in terms of getting started and looking at the data set, how does an organization keep up with the evolving data and the changes in the power grid over time and tracking GHG emissions? Where should they start from, and how do they manage that over time, considering it's a fluid situation? Any advice from either Joe or Ben?
I can take a first crack, Ben. I mean, it's a big and complex question, and it's pretty organizational specific, right? So chances are, when you start carbon accounting, you're not gonna just upend your existing bill tracking and accounting system, at least not in the first 6 months. So the key is to first kind of inventory what you have and what you don't have. To Ben's point about garbage in, garbage out, like it's only garbage if you don't know it's garbage, right? Like if you identify what the gaps are in your data coverage, you can work to improve those and get a plan in place. So I'd say first things first, figure out what you have in terms of utility bill tracking. Sometimes it might surprise you if you're really getting started on this from square one, like it might surprise you the sources that might be useful. Perhaps you don't have utility bills tracked specifically, but you may have them tracked in an invoice payment system or something like that, right? So I think starting with the data completeness inventory, and then as quickly as possible getting a very specific plan in place for data quality improvement, and having somebody own that plan is the key. If it's a memo that gets written and like set on a shelf somewhere, then that's probably not going to get the results you want. But you need to have one or more people and really dedicate the resources to it. Somebody who's going to truly get their head around the data, understand it, understand the gaps, and then engage the right vendors and the right internal stakeholders to improve data quality. There's a lot of other steps, but I think that's the most fundamental kind of foundational one.
Great. Thanks so much, Joe. Next question, which I guess there could be sort of a couple different parts to this, a few questions that came in around it, sort of regarding scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So they all sort of can hit at different areas, who's responsible, and where things should be included. So the question that came in was why is it important to include scope 2 and 3? If everyone essentially included their scope 1s, that would sort of be inclusive. And I'm going to take that and expand a little bit from some of the other questions and focus it on landlord and tenant emissions. So is there collaboration between landlords and tenants in terms of developing footprints? how is that relationship in the real estate industry and the industry as a whole, and understanding, what's being tracked, and everyone sort of getting on the same page in terms of who's responsible for tracking what, so that they can make some assessments going forward. Or is it still too new and everyone's sort of doing their own thing? What's sort of the state of the industry in terms of tracking scope 1, 2, and 3? Ben, you can talk about sort of your approaches and where you've gone, in addition to what you mentioned during your part. And then specifically relationships between landlords and tenants, and whether there's some collaborative efforts there to understand that breakdown.
Yeah, so I think that if everyone tracked scope 1, it would be good, and we would capture a lot of emissions. But I do believe that there are scope 2 emissions in our portfolio where we have some influence. We buy a lot of power. We have the ability to use that buying power to influence more renewable energy development. And so I think companies should be taking responsibility for scope 2, and in scope 3, we build a lot of new development. Close to 90% of our scope 3 emissions come from our new development pipeline, and we're essentially purchasing steel and concrete, which is produced way downstream, but we should be looking at how we can adjust our procurement and improve that supply chain, and at the very least, demanding more data from that supply chain to signal to the manufacturers of concrete and steel that their customers care about the carbon intensity of their product. So if we ignored it and didn't disclose on it, we wouldn't be sending those signals to the utilities, the steam generators, the local distribution companies, the wholesale suppliers of energy, and the fabricators of building materials. So that's why we do it. Secondly, there's been moderate collaboration on greenhouse gas emissions between landlords and tenants. It's mostly just us getting the data from tenants, and certain tenants that are behind utility meters providing us with the data that they're consuming within our buildings when we don't have visibility of that data. That's been supported by green leasing, and the Institute for Market Transformation has some great green leasing language if you're looking for it. That clause allowing us to collect data from tenants is in all of our master lease form contracts. So that's the collaboration. I don't know if you're inferring there should be collaboration beyond that. We definitely have tenants asking more about where our power is coming from, and they're looking to decarbonize their real estate footprint, and that is adding to the value proposition for us to go out and buy green power, which isn't always competitive with brown power in certain markets. That's a signal a customer is sending us. It's very important. We want to see more of that, and work with them to deliver sustainable outcomes for them and also for Boston Properties, because we do account for tenant emissions in our whole building energy data. We have a 42 million square foot portfolio that we actively manage, and we include all of the tenant emissions in our annual reporting. So it behooves us to partner and collaborate with tenants to decarbonize energy supply, but also work with them on behavior, how they're using lights and plugs within their space.
Well said, Ben. And I would just add to that I would encourage commercial real estate owners to think of their tenant relationship beyond just give us your data, right? I think there's ripe opportunities here for tenant partnerships around shared environmental objectives. So we have a couple of clients who are doing carbon neutrality programs and have a tenant engagement program as part of that to say, chances are, and usually when you survey your tenants, in the commercial real estate space, anywhere from 40 to 60% of them probably already have their own carbon reduction targets or ESG goals. So a lot of times there's value add there to make it not just a data sharing relationship, but an actual partnership where you say, we're going to go in together to make this building carbon neutral. Like, let's do green power procurement together. Let's, jointly buy offsets, like whatever that, let's work on energy efficiency projects together and try to solve the tenant landlord split incentive problem. So I think it starts with give us your data, but I think it can be a lot more value accretive than that, and ultimately be a selling point to the tenants if you frame it the right way.
Great, thanks you both. We have time for maybe one or two more questions. So Ben, I think this one's for you. The actual question that came in was how much has GHG management added to your firm's overhead, which I think is an important question. But I would sort of add on to that and rephrase it as sort of what suggestions have you had and what's your experience like been working with senior leadership to sort of get the buy-in to focus on carbon emissions? What's sort of the driving business factor there?
Yeah, well, I mean, there is a G&A expense associated with the sustainability program. So the expense of me and an analyst across an enterprise of 52 million feet is really immaterial. And portfolio manager is a free tool that anybody can use. The expense is de minimis when you consider the size of our portfolio and the value we've gotten from institutional investors through activities like our green bond issuances, through greater recognition from the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark Assessment, GRESB, MSCI, Sustainalytics. I mean, increasingly our company is defined by ESG performance. It's not an expense that has mattered, and we've gotten a huge amount of upside outside of energy conservation, because everyone goes to like, how many kilowatt hours did you save? We're getting a huge amount of return from the identification we have now as a brand with ESG leadership, and that is going to continue to increase, particularly as investors simply won't invest in companies that aren't taking an aggressive stance towards decarbonization. So I don't know how you put like a yield on what we've provided. That's hard to do. But I can tell you that the overhead expense is not something anybody is concerned with or regretting that they've made among our senior leadership. I will say a signal that we've gotten that this has become more important is we just launched this year a board level sustainability committee. So there's a committee of our board of directors chaired by Diane Hoskins, the co-CEO of Gensler. And our executive team is looking to spend more time on sustainability and spend more of their time. That's an expense, right? When you have executives all focused on GHG emissions and sustainability, and they're voluntarily focused more on this because it's so important. So I don't think they're at all concerned about the overhead expense of myself and an analyst if they're wanting to spend more of their personal time thinking strategically about how we decarbonize and lead on sustainability.
Great, thanks so much. We are at time. I'll throw out one more question and then we'll close it out for those who can stay on just one more minute. And that's sort of the role of carbon offsets, and as you look towards reductions. We had a question coming around that. We had a question coming around, what's a path to cutting carbon emissions, let's say by 10% for a commercial building that's already made some obvious improvements like lighting and HVAC. Where do you kind of go from here with the data and efforts to reduce from a strategic standpoint?
Yeah, I can take the first crack at that. So I think the way to think about emissions reduction pathways is kind of that wedge analysis that I showed, and that your pathway to zero emissions or to emissions reduction is going to have lots of different constituent parts, and the shape of that, how much each of those components makes up, is going to just totally be dependent on your preferences, your priorities, your willingness to pay, and the opportunities that are present in your portfolio. But what you're seeing start to emerge, and I think this is becoming very common practice, is this concept of a priority waterfall, that not all emissions reductions are equal in their quality, their impact, or their optics, quite frankly. That things like energy efficiency and on-site renewable energy are better in almost every way, in the sense that they generate financial returns, are value accretive to the property, and have direct, measurable operational emissions reduction impact at the property level. But they can't get you all the way there most of the time, although sometimes they can. If it's it's a warehouse, for example, with no natural gas, and you can cover all of the electric load with a rooftop solar system, then maybe you can get most of the way there with just on-site renewables. But once you move beyond those sorts of upgrades, looking at things like green power procurement, there's lots of different ways to procure green power, where you are directly purchasing green power from specific generation assets, doing virtual power purchase agreements, or buying it from utilities in a variety of different flavors, right, doing on-site power purchase agreements or off-site power purchase agreements. So there's lots of different flavors of green power procurement that are now available. The EPA's Green Power Partnership website is a fantastic resource, probably the best one I've seen. It's kind of summarizing all of those options. And then from there, you look at things like renewable energy certificates and carbon offsets, which are basically a straight cost, right? There's no ROI associated with buying those. They're just a fixed, there's an operating expense that you have to incur. They're also typically considered to be the lower impact than those operational changes, but they can still be part of a comprehensive emissions reduction strategy. So I think the way to think about this is not as a single right answer, but rather as a sort of prioritized set of options, and you need to be kind of, I think, thoughtful and transparent about the way that you prioritize where those emissions reductions come from.
Great. Well, thanks so much. We are a few minutes over, so I want to thank our panelists. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Joe. Thanks for meeting organizers and the attendees. I will say we will have part 2 of this on September 30th, so if you're not registered for that, once you go and sign up, we'll be hearing from more practitioners, MetLife, Kilroy, and Link Industrial on some of the things they've been doing in this area. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.